welcome everybody to the Jamstack Zhuzh. Zhuzh. This is Jamstack Zhuzh.
It's like
However you want
juice,
to spell
but
it, however you want to say it,
We're
that
gonna
is what
spend the
it
next
is.
hour debating how to pronounce it.
I mean,
Right, exactly.
on a
It'll
call
be in.
where the essence of it is kind of naming is difficult, the fact that Zhuzh is in there, and I mean, we're off on like proving the point straight away. It's great.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it really plays into the brand quite nicely, I think. So yeah, this is the Jamstack Zhuzh. It's a discussion about the future of the Jamstack community. Yeah, and we kind of want to just have a nice, lighthearted discussion about where the Jamstack is, where we want it to go, and if we can have sort of a community organized, community led version of the Jamstack moving forward, or if even that's something that folks want. So today, I'm joined by our lovely panelists. We have four folks that have been gracious enough to join me today. We have Brian Rinaldi. He runs the Jamstack newsletter, developer experience engineer at Launch Darkly, runs CFE.dev, and also heads up Orlando Devs. We have Jared White. Say hello, Jared. Creative director at White Fusion, creator of Bridgetown, site generator, and also the proprietor of spicyweb.dev. It's a great site that has some very nice, spicy web development blog posts. We also have Brittany Postma, a staff engineer at Provi, a mentor at Zero to Mastery Academy, front-end dev at codingcat.dev, and founded Svelte Sirens, also a Svelte ambassador and Svelte contributor.
don't list all the things.
You want me to keep going?
No.
Do you have more additions? And finally, we have Phil Hawksworth, who has literally written the book on Jamstack, the author of Modern Web Development on the Jamstack, a very, very early Netlify employee, creator of the static site clock, set your watch by.netlify.app, and a world-renowned choral singer. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you very much.
I just want to start off just real quick with a very simple rapid fire icebreaker. I know folks love icebreakers. I want to know how many files are in your computer's trash folder or recycle bin if you're on Windows. So I'll give you a minute to look that up. Just kind of give some insight into how folks manage their local computing environment, how often they clean their trash folder out, and
So I don't know what
just
this says
more.
about me, but my trash is empty.
Oh,
there we
come
go.
on. That's,
There we go. Starting off strong. Jared, 0. I have 4 things in my trash folder right now. Is anyone else
Guys,
willing
it's hard for me to get
weigh
an
in?
exact number here. How do you figure out the number?
I think that it shows in the taskbar at the bottom of your Finder. I mean,
Oh,
the
it
little
does.
bar that shows up in the bottom of your Finder.
I was trying to figure out too. How do you find the number?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that
I mean, if
bad.
you-
Mine's only like probably, I think it's like, it looks like about 20.
Yeah, mine's about 20. I would
Oh,
say
okay.
too. Something like that.
mine's about 40, but that includes folders, and I'm not going to look in the folders. So I can't
Y'all
see.
are
Well,
Same.
just
Same.
incredibly organized.
it could be
We have
the
an
other way,
incredibly
Zach.
group.
It could be that we're not that organized. It's just that we're running low on disk space, and so we're desperately emptying. I mean, I'm only speaking for myself, but
Well, yeah, I mean, the
don't like to look in
node modules folder can grow, so if you don't clear those out quite enough, then yeah, you'll run out low on disk space for sure. All right, I appreciate you for indulging me in that ridiculous icebreaker. Yeah, today I think we just want to sort of maybe level set a little bit about just a quick discussion about just what folks think about the Jamstack generally. I know it's a very broad topic, and there's been thousands and thousands of words spilled on the blogosphere in the last month or so about just investment in the Jamstack, what the Jamstack is as a definition. And I think it means sort of marginally different things to a lot of people. So maybe as a way to introduce that topic, I think an easy segue into that would be, what was your personal introduction to the Jamstack? It could be a project that you worked on, maybe a tool that you used that was Jamstack based. Maybe it was a conference talk. Just maybe an early introduction to the Jamstack style architecture of sites. And I think, Phil, maybe I'll start with you since you seem to be shuffling the least amount in your chair.
Okay, amazing. Well, before I start on that, you did say I literally wrote the book. I think Brian's written a book on Jamstack as well. I think Brian's written a proper book, a couple. So I mean, I kind of gonna give props there.
Great,
but
yes.
so my first introduction, I suspect, like many, I was probably using it before I knew before I'd heard the name. I think that's probably a common thing because I don't think it's a terribly new thing, although the name is maybe newer than the thing. But I'm sure we'll get into that in a bit. But when I was working at a big kind of advertising agency, I was often involved in trying to figure out how to build sites for clients, and they'd often have very complicated stacks that they wanted us to use and a simple site experience they wanted us to create. And so I got quite excited by Jekyll. I liked Jekyll. I liked turning templates and data into content and then serving them as static assets. And so I found that I was doing that quite often for certain projects and then trying to pitch it more and more often. And at the point I was doing that, I guess this is around 2013, 2013, I guess I was doing this. And so I started talking about that at conferences, like as if I'd discovered something magical and new when it was actually doing things how we used to do things in the old day, just a return to simplicity. And along the way, the thing that really made me excited about it wasn't so much as serving things as static, but the tooling that allowed us to do it. So build automation and some of the tools that were popping up. So that's how I was talking about it. And then I think introduced at conferences things that I discovered, some of the tooling around it, like Jekyll and GitHub Pages and BitBalloon, which was the forerunner to Netlify, and then got to know the folks at Netlify who were trying to figure out a way to talk about their stuff. And so it was conversations with them really that brought the term to me. I think they were trying to decide what to call it. So it was around that kind of time. So that was my introduction to it, but I was kind of using it before I knew what to call it. I had a name of my own for it because I felt it needed a name, and I don't know if I dare share that or not.
Please do.
Okay, I was describing it as the types of sites I was building were, I said they used a short stack because I like pancakes, I guess, and I figured it shortened the stack. There were fewer pieces in the stack, so I would describe things as a short stack. That name never went anywhere because it was just me doing this, but I was trying to describe things to clients because describing the component parts really didn't land. So anyway, that's my introduction. Sorry, long answer.
Yeah, that's great. I do like the term short stack. I think that's fine. I'm okay with that. I would have been okay with that as an alternative to Jamstack for sure.
No, that's
Brittany, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So when I was learning to code, came across the Jamstack in learning React and found the Gatsby framework in learning just through video tutorials and in Gatsby heard about the Jamstack, but I guess really it was before that and I didn't really know that I was using the Jamstack. And once I found out about the Jamstack, I was like, I love this type of architecture because at the time it was like JavaScript APIs markup. And that was the thing that eventually drew me to Svelte because that was like that vanilla flavor that Svelte kind of brings to the table is what I loved about it. And that's what Jamstack was, is like just that vanilla type of stuff. And I could do these things easier, I felt like, than having all of this extra boilerplate and more stuff that I didn't need that kind of got in my way. And I always loved that about the Jamstack. And I felt like it was a community of developers and more than just the architecture. It was about like bringing people together, almost like has become this ecosystem of tooling now that brings multiple frameworks together. Like you have Vue, Svelte, Quick, Solid, all using V, and they're all in that community now. And that's the way Jamstack was originally. And that's kind of where Jamstack was for me. Like when I started learning, and I feel like I kind of grew up around it. Like I learned to code around Jamstack, and I've loved it ever since.
Yeah, that's great. I love the point that that it's more about the community than the architecture. I think that's great, and that really kind of speaks to what we're trying to get to today. Brian, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I got my start, I guess around like 2012, 2013 with Jekyll, somewhere around that. Like, and I, as with a lot of zigs and zags in my career, it's always starts with an employer telling me no. So I went to my employer. I'm like, listen, we got to build this project. It was a big content site. I'm like, rather than use WordPress, because I've gotten frustrated with WordPress and like it being, all the plugins and the performance and things. I'm like, can we just do this whole thing in Jekyll? And ultimately they said, no, we're doing WordPress. And then I became just kind of obsessed with writing, proving out that like this was a legitimate way to build things, because they were basically kind of blew it off like, no, this sounds like a toy. It's not for real. So I started writing about it, speaking about it, building projects with it. Even like I met Matt and Chris early on, because I was speaking at HTML5 like meetup in San Francisco. That was in the Google offices, which like all about static site generators. And it was like, it was amazing too. There was like 300 people there. It was incredible. Like, and they were one of them. They came and told me about the project they were working on that hadn't yet released yet. So, anyway, I've been in it a long time. I've seen all the twists and turns, kind of like a number of us have, all the debates. So yeah, that's where I got my start though.
Yeah, that's great. I think that a lot of folks on this panel really sort of started with Jekyll in a way. And yeah, just in doing my research for this panel and listening to what y'all are saying now, I think my own personal introduction was through Jekyll. So yeah, that's great. I think, Jared, you might have a similar experience. I think I've read some of your blog posts that maybe reflect that same opinion, but I'd love to hear more.
Yeah. Same story here. And it's funny, I think I really started to try out Jekyll in earnest around 2016, having just thrown up my hands at yet another WordPress install gone awry, and just lots of headaches trying to work with clients doing these heavy duty installs, and found Jekyll, and I felt like I'd found it real late at the time, and this was 2016. It's like, oh man, I wish I'd known about this sooner. But it was great. Yeah, I started to promote that to clients, and I started to figure out ways to sort of bring some of my Ruby on Rails development experience to bear with like back-end APIs and back office stuff that the public Jekyll sites could kind of connect to. And it was really fun just pushing the envelope with that sort of hybrid architecture, if you want to call it that. Yeah, and then when Netlify and the term Jamstack came along, I was really excited because it felt like a better way to communicate to clients what it was about, rather than like, so there's this static site thing and there's a dynamic site, and the static site's secure and performant, but the dynamic site has a database so you can log into that, but you can't. It just gets real messy and complicated. So to just sort of say like Jamstack, it's the hot new thing, it just made those conversations easier. So for at least the time there, it was exciting to have the sense of a community and a sort of approach and a philosophy, and also just like having content just right there in a Git repo, and it's really easy to work with, is super appealing to me as well.
Yeah, I think that having a Git-based deployment model is a great benefit. I'm curious if you folks think that, because I've kind of been thinking a lot about what a minimum viable Jamstack site is. Trying to like get the definition down to just as few things as possible. Because I do kind of feel like it's gotten more and more cloudy as time has gone by. And I think I've kind of settled on four different things. Uh, Performance, which is kind of based around pre-built markup on the CDN. And that's kind of like more back-end performance. It's not really, it doesn't have much to say about front-end performance. Security, which is the second thing, which is really coming down to like a reduced attack surface, trying to limit the amount of code that's running as part of a request. You're sort of generating as much things statically as possible, which also feeds into the scalability of it. So that's like more of the third thing. And then I think the fourth thing that's really not discussed quite as much as I think maybe it should be is portability. So when you have a site that basically generates to a folder of static files, it becomes very portable to move that between hosting environments, which I think is great.
I think you basically just laid out the original Jamstack manifesto that Matt
The
wrote.
original.
Yeah, the original.
Yeah.
That was what was everything that was in it.
Yeah, and
And it was very clear what that, like how we achieved that with when it was purely static.
Yeah,
And
that's what I was going to say.
it became
too.
less, like some of those pieces, particularly like security and things like that, like became less clear as the definition expanded.
And then as we brought in like
Jamstack.
serverless functions, and can we use server-side rendering now? Like how can we bring these other pieces of architecture into Jamstack?
Yeah, I think
yeah,
there's now 50 different types of rendering or something like that.
I mean,
50 plus.
at the
something.
start of the call, by the end of the call, there'll be more.
We'll
There's
invent a
always
few
room
more
for
here
more.
while we're talking.
Yeah, exactly. I think the main point I'm trying to bring across here is that do you all feel like the development operations side of it, or the development predictability, the atomic deploys, the Git-based deploy workflow, is that part of the minimum viable Jamstack? Is that piece of it part of the continuing definition for y'all? And you can have different answers. We don't need to have consensus. Maybe I'll go to Phil first, since you
I'm
started.
sorry,
talking.
I didn't mean to like suddenly swoop in and just start
I've realized that I need to call on people to speak. Sorry.
We're all polite. That's what it is. We're all kind of going to stand and wait for each other. I was going to say, maybe controversially, I don't think so. I don't think actually that is a core part of the definition. I do think that's one of the key enablers that makes it compelling. But this is already getting into the nub of the problem for me. I think in that it's difficult to come up with a name for a thing like this that could potentially encapsulate so many different things, because even when you described the minimum viable Jamstack site a moment ago, I think what you were listing were the benefits, the core benefits of when it's done well, rather than the things that make it like qualify something to be Jamstack, because you can create something which is secure from lots of different means. But I think good security with a low level of effort is one of the core benefits of doing a Jamstack site well. I mean, I would potentially argue that the minimum viable Jamstack site is an HTML5 file on a static server. That would be my minimum viable Jamstack site, but that isn't very compelling, because I think the thing that really makes it viable is the deployment process that gets it there, and the build automation, and the suitability for it to have immutable deploys and atomic rollbacks and what have you. But I don't think that's necessarily the attribute of a Jamstack site. I think that's just those are the things that have made static sites feel more compelling, because you can automate the process of building them and what have you, which when you group all of those things together, you kind of need a name to describe them, I felt. And so those are the things that kind of go into what we describe as Jamstack, I think. But it's yeah. So I guess my answer to the original question, what's the minimum viable Jamstack site? I'd say it's an HTML file on a static server, but
Does it
it's difficult to end there, isn't it?
no?
Yes, I think it does. Because that's what well, sorry, I said that in a very kind of like dismissive. Yes, of course it does. I think so because that's what browsers understand. You can't deploy anything to a browser without some HTML first. So yes, I would say it has to be at least HTML. I don't think you could serve something else instead. And I don't know what do other people think.
I would agree with you in that. First of all, when I got started, there was no there wasn't really a Git deploy process for it anywhere. Like I was actually using FTP. I don't know if you all remember what that is. Um, and it was such a pain in the butt that there was tools people had built. I can't even remember what they were that like helped you just automatically FTP stuff so that I didn't have to actually manually move the things once the deploy ran. Um, I mean, I would still consider what I was doing to fall under Jamstack. But I'd say I also agree with Phil's larger point that one of the struggles that we've had is that when we speak about the benefits of Jamstack, which has kind of always been the selling point, is like we speak about the benefits of Jamstack, but then somebody else is like, it was like, oh, well, I do all those pieces, right? And I develop in X. And so I'm doing Jamstack. And I've heard that argument so many times where it's like, oh yeah, I must be doing Jamstack because what I'm doing fits all those pieces, even the JavaScript APIs and markup. Once we had that like acronym, like it's like, oh yeah, I'm using all those, but I'm doing it in PHP. It's like, yeah, you are, I guess, but that's not really Jamstack, and you'd get into a whole debate because it wasn't about, if we sell it on the benefits, and it's harder to define. And I always tried to kind of narrow it down to like there's a subset of tools and services that kind of all fit within this ecosystem. And I think a lot of people did these maps for a while of like what everything in Jamstack was. Because I think when people really ended up saying like, oh, I'm a Jamstack developer, it was because I'm using some of those tools and things and I'm doing things the way it prescribes, but it wasn't about like, oh yeah, my site's secure because that I could do that in any number of technologies. So yeah, I generally agree with Phil's point there.
I think I disagree because I
Yes,
think
here we
it
go.
can be markup of any type. It can be a template because you a compiler or a build step to still get that static output for the browser. Or even if it's not static, however you're rendering, you can get that output that the browser can read. I think it can be a markup template of your choosing. That's what Svelte is and does. I mean, I wouldn't be in this conversation, I don't think, if we didn't allow for non HTML files, because I don't use HTML files in Svelte.
Yeah, I mean, that does bring up a very interesting point just in the dynamism space. So if you have a build process that generates PHP files at the end, is that a Jamstack site? I don't know. Folks have used Eleventy to generate PHP sites before, and that's not a use case that I have used myself, but
Yeah.
I mean,
I
it
wonder
seems like a
if you're
very
like putting the framework in the browser, kind of like React does. Like if you're pushing more framework to the browser to read the template, then is that Jamstack? Like, do we draw the line there? Or like, does it have to like pre-render that and serve up the actual HTML for the browser?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to the question of back-end performance versus front-end performance. So Jamstack, in my mind, really came to popularity around the same time that single-page applications came to popularity. Excuse me, and yeah, it kind of ran the gamut of sort of, I don't know, pre-built markup all the way from front to back, and maybe more application shell style sites. And I think that was useful in a way. I like that Jamstack sort of was a big tent for both of those camps. Um, and I'm curious, Jared, what your perspective is here. I know that maybe you're also someone that comes from the more pre-built markup camp, trying to generate as much upfront as possible. What do you
Yeah,
think about,
yeah,
yeah,
and I,
sort of
and I
the performance question?
yeah, and I think Phil and Brittany are kind of saying the same thing, but Brittany was kind of going at the heart of the authoring experience, and yeah, like I think from an authoring standpoint, there are so many different template formats out there, like so many different programming languages for the web have sort of their own flavors of templates, and then if you just look at JavaScript frameworks, there are so many different ways to write components and templates there. I think for me, it's a question of what does this compile down to and when. And so for me, when I look at Jamstack, it starts to answer a when question right away. Like, when does the markup get generated that the browser will read? And to me, like, it should be, I say should, but like in my mind, the answer would be, most, if not all, of the markup is generated at compile time. So when the site has been built, when it's been compiled, when there's been that transformation, that build step at a certain point in time, like that's now a deployable artifact. And if you don't do anything else in the future, that artifact could live forever. And I actually think longevity is a really nice selling point of Jamstack, because I have sites that have been online for years and just nobody needs to touch them. They're just there. They run great because they were compiled, like a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and it's fine. Like we don't need to recompile the website because nothing needs to change. So, I think the issue with sort of saying like, oh well, like a site that just has div id equals root, that's a static site, and like React boots up and does everything. It's like, yeah, but now everything you're seeing in the browser just got built now. Like everything, your whole single page app just initialized out of the blue. The only static site part of it was like a little harness. And to me, like, sure, there are architectures out there where you need to do that, but is that Jamstack? I would personally argue no, but I'm sure there are folks that would be surprised by that.
Ben said something really awesome, I think, in the chat, and he said that sites and tools are not Jamstack. Jamstack is a rallying banner, and I like it's a pretty good point.
Yeah, I think that kind of gets back to the core of the discussion here. Do we want the Jamstack to be a big tent that really appeals to as wide of a base as possible, in order to get as multiplying effects from the community? Or do we want it to be very prescriptive about the tools and the sort of the architecture rules behind the tools that generate sites on the Jamstack? And I think that is kind of gets at the heart of the identity crisis that exists right now, because I think the community is split in many ways. A lot of folks are in Camp A and a lot of folks are in Camp B. It seems like Jared is in a camp and Brittany's might be in the other camp, and that's fine.
Yeah, and I think part of this is down to the fact that we've already heard just a few different opinions about what could constitute like the minimum viable like site, and I think there's a Jamstack site rather, and there's already some kind of technical tastes kind of coming forward. And one of my biggest problems that I always had when talking about Jamstack publicly is that people would level the criticism at me and of the architecture to me, which I think was based on a slight misunderstanding, and that was conflating single page applications and Jamstack. And I think that's partly the fault of those of us who communicated about Jamstack, and the fact that it starts with a great big capital J that stands for JavaScript, because you'll notice that when I described the minimum viable Jamstack site, I didn't talk about JavaScript. I talked about an HTML file. Now, of course, when Brittany was describing a Svelte project, that would be loaded with HTML that then call off the JavaScript, right? So I think that's the next stage down. I think that's perfectly valid. But I think what often happened was that people would think that Jamstack meant single page application, that where everything was rendered in the client, and it can be, but it doesn't have to be. And as soon as you start saying things like it can be this, but it could be that, then it's like, well, what is it then? And I think for me, Jamstack is maybe best characterized by what's missing, which often feels like a very negative way to talk about a thing, saying, well, it's everything but this. And the thing that I think is missing is an active application server. That's the thing that you don't have to have. And I think that's common to just a site that's served with static HTML files to something that's pre-generated and compiled down using Svelte, but then is delivered through static HTML files and JavaScript, or a single page application that's got lots of client-side rendering. They're all good solutions for different things, and I wouldn't use the same solution for everything, of course, but they're all united by the fact that they can be delivered and as a result can be portable and performant and all the rest of these benefits that you mentioned, because you don't have to manage an active application server as well. And I think that's the thing that sets Jamstack apart from the others, but is sometimes feels a bit negative as a way of trying to articulate something. It's everything in the world except these. It's like, well, that's quite broad. But for me, web serverless, if you like, is how I sometimes think. I'll throw another term out there. Why not? Is a characteristic that I think kind of encapsulates lots of things that I would personally describe as a site built using a Jamstack approach.
Yeah, I think that just managing fewer things and reducing complexity is a very attractive proposition for so many developers as we get more and more specialized and we have to manage more and more things.
Yeah.
Any reduction in that is helpful. Go ahead, Brian.
But I would say that's part of where Jamstack struggles with these things, because it became increasing. I mean, I made a joke about the 50 rendering methods, like that. I mean, it became like where I had to give a talk about all the different rendering options there were. At the time it was Next.js, but it kind of led into a lot of the major frameworks. And I think what I hope to see is going back to that simplicity, which was, I think, the key selling point, and maybe a piece that was missing in that original manifesto, which focused on things like security and performance, but it was the simplicity. And I think a lot of us who started back then, that's what we loved. We went from something that had grown, like WordPress and other application servers, that had grown incredibly complex and a lot of different, I mean, not even, and compared to today, it's nothing, right? Like it was, but at the time it felt complex, and it was often like painful when something broke. We didn't know where it broke because there was a lot of different moving parts. And then we moved to this, which reduced all that complexity. But over time, we gained it back with all kinds of different things we added to these frameworks that just became difficult again. It became difficult to explain. It became difficult to learn. I thought the learning curve became really steep for a while. I mean, it still is kind of, but I do feel like, we are going back to that. I mean, you've had that as part of 11D kind of from the beginning, is maintaining that simplicity. I also see tools like Astro also kind of generally trying to maintain that simplicity, although adding in pieces, I think, to stay competitive, but still relatively simple. So I'm hoping we go back to that, because I think that's where the key differentiator for Jamstack could be, is just from a developer standpoint, like this is simpler, and it doesn't, I think what we lost was we tried to fit more and more sites, more and more types of sites. And I think it's okay to narrow it down to be like, Jamstack is good for these things, and it's not necessarily good for those things. And while though you may use some of those principles in these other things, and some may carry over, it doesn't mean, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, it's not Jamstack. That's okay.
Yeah, I love that idea behind sort of simplifying the definition and sort of going back to a clearer definition, because I really think that when folks hear Jamstack, they don't necessarily think of it as a silver bullet. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution to every problem. although I would say newer iterations of that and the bigger tent sort of strategy of Jamstack has come closer to silver bullet status, but it's in many ways has, I don't know, gone against the original intent. So in my mind, thinking back to Jamstack was sort of created as this like antithesis to WordPress originally. That's how I came into it. That's why I started using Jekyll, and that's why I really fell in love with static sites. And now we have sort of a lot more dynamic power as in under the Jamstack umbrella, but it's sort of introducing the same risks that sort of befell WordPress to begin with. So yeah, I'm curious if y'all have sort of, I don't know, developed sites that are Jamstack but are using serverless functions primarily as the delivery mechanism. So not just statics first, but more everything is routed through serverless or edge compute. If folks are developing sites currently using that model. Brittany, I'll just go to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, I've done a few things on Edge and on serverless, and then I know that like learn.svelte.dev, they've moved like the docs and those sites to like some of the serverless and Edge technologies too, and there's lots of downtime. They still have like experimental status. I don't think they're all still fully like functioning correctly. So that's like one of the like edge cases, like not to use puns, but like it's just they're just I don't know. I like them a lot. I think they're good, especially for people that aren't like fully back end devs like me. Like I love front end. I'm not great at back end. I would rather write a server, have to like dive into how a server works and running a full server, but the technology just isn't stable. It seems like, yeah.
I mean, it does kind of go back to that there's a trade-off that exists when we introduce more dynamism. Jared, if you want to go next.
So this is where I start getting real spicy real fast, and I will try to I'll try to remember Zach's original entreaty to remain lighthearted, but I feel like, and I've been trying to think of like a hook for this, and I thought back to an old Apple sort of round table where they said that they had designed themselves into a bit of a thermal corner when it came to the Mac Pro. And I don't know if you all remember this, but like at one time the Mac Pro was like a round trash can, and they were all like, can't innovate anymore, my ass. And then it turned out that was all a really bad idea, and they designed themselves into this thermal corner and had to design themselves out again. And I feel like with Jamstack, we need to have a little bit of a moment of reckoning, because we've been talking about like, oh, the tent got bigger and bigger, but it only got bigger in one specific direction, and I have to question why it got bigger that direction. So, but to make this concrete, like my background is as a Ruby on Rails developer, as I've mentioned, and while I don't necessarily write and deploy new Rails apps that often anymore, back in the sort of height of my Jekyll and Rails days, to me, it seemed perfectly reasonable to have a public-facing Jekyll site that's statically built and deployed, but then there's an API off in a corner somewhere that it either talks to at build time or it talks to through some kind of client-side JavaScript. And maybe folks in the organization can log into this Rails server and do some stuff there. And to me, that was perfectly fine as Jamstack, because while the Rails server by itself wasn't necessarily a Jamstack deploy, the Jamstack deploy could talk to it, and that's cool, and that worked fine for the projects I was building. And then it felt like there was this little switch where Jamstack went from, hey, build and deploy static sites that can talk to APIs if they need to, whether that's at build time or at runtime, to Jamstack is static sites plus serverless functions. serverless functions. And the selling point there presumably is you don't need to run servers, you don't need to maintain servers, just use serverless functions. And that never really made sense to me because I didn't necessarily need to maintain any servers either building Ruby on Rails sites, like whether you deploy to render or well, now I would deploy a render, but back then maybe deploy to Heroku or deploy to whatever. Like there are plenty of managed services out there where you don't have to know Linux, you don't need to install PostgreSQL, you don't need to update packages, you don't need to do any of that. You just write some code, push it up to Git and you're done. And it's maybe slightly more complicated than serverless functions from a DX standpoint, but not that much more complicated, perhaps. So to me, serverless functions was like, here's a cool new tech, and we're going to integrate it into Jamstack because we can. But if you're building these other things with these other tools, that's not Jamstack. And to me, that was always sort of a, more coming from like, we're the hosting company that benefits from saying this is what Jamstack is, more than here's what developers actually need in the world. And that's where I feel like I would just say we need a little bit of an acknowledgement that, if we're going to say Jamstack is a big tent, I feel like we have to enlarge it to encompass, somebody writing an Express app in Node.js and deploying it up to Heroku. Because if you say, well, that's not Jamstack, then I would say, well, why are all these other things Jamstack? I think that's a distinction that is unnecessary.
I'm gonna chime in if you don't mind. I'll disagree a little bit here.
Go ahead.
Which is that, I mean, I get the perspective that this was all driven by like business decisions, and I think they're obviously, like, I'm not going to say that business decisions didn't play a factor, but I always felt like Jamstack started like it started largely as a front end developer thing, right? Like this is people like, and we started adding in tools that to me helped the front end developer kind of move further towards the back end, right?
So did Netlify.
To where, right? But that's my point. It's like the thing is that I don't think it was just purely business decisions. It's like, well, I'm a front end developer, and I need to be able to like do some API work and stuff like that. But do some back end stuff. But I really don't want to. I don't know Ruby, and I don't want to have to learn Ruby, and I don't have to like set up a node server somewhere to do that all back end work. So like, if I can just write a function that just auto deploys for me, hey, that's great. And I'll be say like, as I loved it, I thought it was great. It was not like something that I felt like was being shoved down my throat. Now I think Jared, you came kind of you were a back end guy who was moving more front end. It feels like because you were a Ruby guy originally. I don't know. Maybe that's why the perspectives are different. But
full stack, but yeah.
But I never felt like some of all of that stuff was driven by business decisions necessarily. I think there were some things, but like just adding in serverless functions wasn't one to me. I think some of the redefining of Jamstack for the broader tent was I think driven by, we have to adapt because Next.js kind of became the predominant way of building stuff, and they're doing these things, and we don't want to we don't want Next.js not to be part of our tent. Otherwise we're pretty narrow at those things maybe. But with that, it's not so spicy. I actually have to jump. As I warned you guys, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna dump that on you and then drop the mic. Mic drop later.
appreciate you coming today, Brian.
All right, thanks for having me.
It's good to see you.
I'll check on what you debate about this after.
Yeah,
see what
we
names we
won't
call you
gossip
when you
about
leave.
you after you leave.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, bye.
All right, see ya. I mean, I do think that brings up a very interesting point just around Jamstack sort of did this pivot in sort of mid 2022 where it transitioned away from the acronym or the initialism, JavaScript APIs and markup, to just the term Jamstack, capitalized much differently. And it does feel like in a way that it again goes back to the same question that we've been talking about today. Do we want this to be a big tent, or do we want this to be a prescriptive thing where people understand very clearly the benefits and the trade-offs they're making when they buy into Jamstack? And I guess I can see both camps, and I think that I belong very clearly to one of those camps, but I won't let my bias show too much here. Yeah, I'm curious what y'all feel about the pivot, or the great schism that exists in the Jamstack world, because it does kind of feel like, yeah, there was an identity crisis that existed, and it's kind of strange to think back that was only a year ago. It feels much longer than that to me, but
Is it only a
Phil,
year
I'll
ago?
let you chime in. Yeah, it's mid
Well, first of, I mean,
2022. Yeah.
that might be the most shocking thing to me on this call, that it was only a year ago, because we've all aged since then, but time's weird these days. Well, I mean, I led a lot of that kind of charge to try and change the way the name was capitalized, and some people like it and some people hate it, and that's fair. I've already kind of alluded to one of the motives for doing that previously, which is about this belief that Jamstack meant single page application, that a Jamstack site had to use JavaScript, and a Jamstack site had to call on APIs. And you know, my contention is that the minimum viable Jamstack site is basically a static site. However you've generated it, however you've built it, that's the minimum viable thing. It's just that it's served from a web server, which effectively can be dumb. So of all those portability reasons. So the fact that people were conflating those two and saying, but Jamstack sites are terrible because you've got to do all of the rendering in the client, I think it was important to clarify that and to try and help avoid that misconception. So that was one of the motivations for moving that, to try and help what is, let's say, is undeniably an imperfect name. The fact that it's got the word stack in it, the fact that it's got an acronym that suggests you've got to use these three things, all of those make it a very imperfect name. And I think that was one of the reasons to try and change that, is to say, let's just make it a noun that's describes something that we think we agree on. And clearly we've never really got full agreement on it. But everything we've talked about so far, I feel still comes back to the thing that I set out, which is that that can be served with a dumb server. And Jared was kind of alluding to, well, you know, it's simple enough to create a server. You don't have to manage a server, and you're quite right. You don't have to manage a physical server with virtualization and all of these different services. The thing I'm talking about, though, is managing an application server, an actual application. So an Express application still needs to stay running, right? And if it falls over, it's fallen down. So you've got to keep it running. And I think maybe maybe I didn't make myself quite clear enough when I was trying to describe that, because the thing that I think kind of extends, nervous saying extends, but kind of expands on Jamstack a little bit when we've got talking about serverless functions, is the fact that they can be ephemeral. They're static things that get served, and they're kind of ephemeral. That if the process dies, well, the next person comes along. We don't have to keep the application running, and I think that's an important thing. But I'm veering from the question you asked, so I'm sorry. I'm kind of steering back to some conversations earlier.
Scaling too.
I'd love to kind of loop back to that, but I should stay on topic because, Zach, you're stewarding the conversation. So anyway, that was the motivation for the name change, which perhaps introduced more confusion rather than clarified it. So I'd be curious to see what kind of faces other people pull and what happens in the chat when we talk about that kind of spelling change.
Yeah, Brittany, I guess I'm curious what your perspective is. Yeah, if you want to.
Yeah. I was still at Netlify a year ago. We were actually all together a year ago today, the three of us. So,
Sorry, Jared, we're teaming up on you right now.
yeah. I mean, obviously, like, Phil was in the conversations with, like, the transition, so he has a little bit of insight into why all of that happened. Obviously, he knows a little bit about that, so listen to what he said. But I do
that
think
could be a curse, that knowledge. So it's better to get a different perspective, I think.
I do think from the business sense, like Netlify is chasing Next.js a little bit. Like you have to keep that in mind, and I do think they want to keep Next.js in that fold, and that's always in the back of their mind, and you have to just keep that in the picture somehow, and so you have to bring that in, and it's just constantly evolving to keep that in play. So I don't know that that had anything to do with it. I just it feels like it may have played into it, but I I don't know. I still think that it can. I think that you can have a server, you cannot have a server. I don't care. I still think it has more to do with the community, and serve whatever kind of site you want as long as you have good performance and some of the basic philosophy. I think it qualifies as Jamstack. You can be my friend no matter what tool you use. I don't care.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I think that the call out to Next.js is a very interesting one, in that I do feel like Next.js really kind of stretched the boundaries of Jamstack. It really did introduce some more runtime things, really at the cost of some portability as well. And in that regard, I think that Next.js is has the capability to be much less Jamstacky than a lot of frameworks that exist today. And that kind of, again, it comes back to this question of, do we want to be very prescriptive because it makes it more easy to communicate these trade-offs, or do we want it to be a big tent that encompasses everything? And I think that you can probably see where my bias is now, in that I'm maybe more in favor of the former, because I want to use Jamstack as an educational term. I want Jamstack to have very concrete definition. I want folks to understand I'm making a Jamstack site. These are the trade-offs that come with that, and sort of move away from this idea that Jamstack should be a silver bullet that can solve all of our problems, because I think as senior software developers, we kind of understand that silver bullets don't really exist.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that you can't use Next.js to create a Jamstack site.
Yes,
Or like there's a hard line there, and where do you draw that line? So it's just it's difficult once you start drawing lines in the mud. Like, where is that line?
yeah, that's a great point, because you can do a static export of a Next.js site, and then it becomes a question of Next.js can be used to build a Jamstack site, but is it a Jamstack tool? I have no idea.
Yeah,
Is that even worth classifying? I'm not sure. Go ahead.
I think, yeah, it's difficult to start to include the tooling into what makes a qualifier for this, because you can use anything, can't you? You can use Bash, you can use WordPress to generate a static site. You can So I think I don't think that helps the quest for clarity, really. I'm keen on turning the tables, actually, and Zach, you've been asking a lot of questions, and you kind of started to express an opinion there, and I'd be really keen to hear when you said you'd quite like it to be quite prescriptive and have a nice clear definition. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what would be included in that.
Yeah, I do agree with your sort of definition in that Jamstack is sort of non-application server-based development. I do like that. But again, I kind of come back to the original sort of Jamstack definition that Matthias sort of developed and talked about at Smashing Conference so many years ago, 7 years ago, I think it is now. And I kind of think about it in terms of, is the site I'm developing rooted in static pre-built markup, or is it rooted in dynamic on request generated markup? So just to be very clear, I would exclude frameworks like Remix from being Jamstack. And I understand that that might be controversial, but I don't think Fresh is necessarily Jamstack. I don't think that Enhanced.dev even is necessarily Jamstack, because that's serverless first. So anything that runs primarily through serverless functions or edge compute, I don't think is Jamstack, which is maybe strange to say, but to me, it really comes back to the original question of Jamstack was the antithesis of WordPress, and WordPress has sort of runtime performance problems. It has security problems associated with it, and I want to move away from those. I want to make the trade-off in the sites that I'm developing to have them be static to work around those issues. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks. No,
Without
that's I really like that, and I think it also it kind of leads us to one of the particular benefits that we talked about right at the beginning that Zach you kind of listed that were in the original manifesto. It's odd saying the word manifesto for this, but yeah, the original manifesto that Matthias wrote, and that is about portability. For me, that was one of the things I would talk about a lot when I started talking about what had yet to be called, Jamstack sites. The fact that pre-generated site using whatever tools, don't care, put them somewhere, wherever, don't care. But the fact is that if that thing goes away, you can pick them up and put them over here. I mean, maybe that's one of the most descriptive and illustrative attributes of actually what goes into making a site like this that we could come up with, and we could do worse than constraining the definition to have that almost as a qualifier. I've come more and more at peace with the idea of technologies that are, I used to say, adjacent to Jamstack, because you could tell I was squirming around the fact that is it Jamstack? I don't know. Is it kind of is an enabler? And talking about serverless functions and edge rendering and all of those things. And I think those are great progressive enhancements almost. I mean, it's almost like progressive enhancement that reaches all the way back to not goes beyond the client. We were talking earlier on about you asked the question, Zach, are you using any predominantly edge rendered or serverless rendered things? And I know that at Netlify we're using quite a lot of sites which are pre-generated, but every request actually passes through an edge function and can progressively enhance something. So is that still Jamstack? I don't know. It still fits with my model of everything's be pre-generated, and now we're doing progressive enhancement, but not in the browser, if you like, which kind of feels, I'm very comfortable with that, and I like that approach, but I don't know if I would describe it as Jamstack from a purist point of view. So maybe your qualifier of is it portable might not be the worst qualifier for that, because of course a site not being Jamstack doesn't mean that it's a bad architecture. That's also a key thing to talk about.
Yeah.
We kind of describe, can we call it Jamstack? Is it good enough? Almost like we're so tribal, in web development that if it doesn't fit into this camp, then it's bad. And that's something I really dislike. So that's one of the things that when Brittany mentioned a few minutes ago about, I like the goal of just the community being able to get together and talk about that. I love that as an aspiration for a valuable thing in a community. But anyway, I'm digressing. I really like your qualifier of portability. That's one of the core things that got me excited in the first place.
Yeah, I really like that too, and actually really resonate with what you're saying, Phil. And I like this idea of there being Jamstack adjacent technologies. Even if we want to get silly and call it Jamstack Plus or Jamstack Extreme or whatever.
professional edition.
Yeah, but I think we need a core thing that is defined, because if that is defined, then we all have a really great shorthand. Like, it would be so awesome to just be all like, yeah, I develop Jamstack sites, and yeah, this tool's a Jamstack tool, and yeah, this is a Jamstack friendly hosting company, and like everyone can kind of say there's this thing, and we kind of all roughly know what it means, and then you can expand outwards, and maybe some flavors of Jamstack Plus or whatever is using serverless functions, or maybe some other flavor is still using a good old Rails monolith off in a corner somewhere, or maybe it's just a static site, and that's totally fine, and you don't need anything more than that. But I think having some kind of core that's well defined is really helpful. It's helpful for education. It's helpful for tools to promote themselves. It's helpful for hosting companies to promote themselves. It's helpful in so many ways. And also, I'll just end here real quick, but talking about like the single page app thing, I think if we're talking about pre-built markup, it kind of means that even if some aspect of your site is kind of SPA land, there's still a basic experience that works for everybody. And like you can disable JavaScript and you don't just get a white page that's unusable. That feels real bad. And there's this sort of larger industry shift, I feel like, towards like more SSR, more progressive enhancement. And if we're starting with static site generators, that's just SSR that happened once, right? It's like SSR that was baked at some point, and now you're just served that pre-baked markup. So I think it's great to like start there, and then we all might have our particular flavors that we like to kind of add on to it. But anyway, those are my unfiltered thoughts.
Yeah, that's great. I guess I think we're coming up on time, so I just want to do one more just rapid fire question if folks have a few minutes. I want to ask if y'all could change anything moving forward, get one benefit out of the Jamstack moving forward, what would you like to see from the Jamstack community in the future? Maybe I'll start with Brittany, if that's okay.
Yeah. Think one benefit out of the Jamstack community going forward. I don't know. I feel like get back to what we were. I feel like we've lost something over the last year with like the name change and the philosophy kind of change, and we've just lost that feeling that it had originally. And I guess I would like to get the feeling back. Does that make sense to everyone? Jamstack is a feeling. You put that in the doc. Like, I want that feeling back.
Yeah, I think that was a quote that was attributed to Jason Langsdorff. Maybe, I don't know, pejoratively. But if you go back and watch that video, there's some extra context there around the original quote. Yeah, I think he was kind of referring to just how, this was pre-name change, actually, how the tent was sort of expanding and how there was a lack of clarity around what Jamstack was and wasn't. But yeah, he was making kind of a joke out of the lack of clarity around Jamstack at the time. So I don't know. I just thought I'd offer some additional context around that quote before we just let that one go. Phil, do you want to go next?
Sure, it's a really difficult question actually. Thinking about this, my biggest kind of wish really is around not feeling like web development is a zero-sum game, and thinking if you like one technology, then all the rest of them belong in a fire. I find that's really counterproductive, because there's lots of different types of experiences, lots of different ways to build for the web, and I think it's great to be excited and enthusiastic about an approach in a technology, but I'd love for that never to spill over into a feeling of dumping on everything else, because sometimes you choose this tool and sometimes you choose the other tool. So I'd kind of like, maybe this is a wish for the web development community larger than the Jamstack community. It's a bit broader, so I don't quite know how far our remit stretches, but that's a behavior that I'd particularly like. It's just an acknowledgement that you can like one thing without that meaning that you dislike the other things, and knowing that you can reach for different tools depending on the thing that you're creating and what your requirements are. And I think that's an important thing to be able to do. There's been lots of talk recently about, is Jamstack dead? And you see that kind of described a lot. And I think we've talked a lot about how the term is problematic and it's difficult, and we've kind of expanded beyond it. And so maybe the term has outlived its usefulness. It was very, very useful for me for a long time, but in its current state, I think it can create more division than unity. So I'd love to get back to more unity. And if that's a change by tightening up that definition in the way that you're describing, Zach, or something along those lines, I'm all in favor of it. But I think the approach at the core of it, the things that we've talked about and the values, I think that's very much alive and well and thriving. And I'd kind of like to get past, you know, the need to really define it very clearly and thrash out what it means. But we're not past it because we don't have pure understanding. And I think maybe some of the things that have been suggested in this conversation would be really helpful to that if we can arrive at that. So I'd be keen to help kind of push us towards that if that's possible.
Yeah, that's great. Jared, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I too would love to kind of move away from this sort of tribalism and you know, I think, yeah, I think the problem I've just run into a number of times, which is why, you know, over a span of a few years, I went from Jamstack yay to it being a big bummer for me, is, you know, comments kind of like, Jamstack is modern web development, and this is the way the modern web gets built. And it's like talking about a very specific tool or a very specific approach that to me was like adding a bunch of stuff on top of Jamstack. And I kind of feel like, you know, if we can be sort of self-reflective and say, you know, Jamstack is a way the modern web gets built, and there are lots of different ways, and Jamstack is one of them, and maybe Jamstack can evolve by integrating well with more and more different approaches. But I just feel like, you know, kind of coming up with a big tent, but in a very specific prescriptive direction, and then saying that's the modern web, I feel like creates that sense of tribalism and really excludes a lot of people. And again, like speaking for myself, like if I want to stand up a simple Ruby app, like, can I do that and be part of Jamstack? And it feels kind of bad if I can't. So, you know, I would love to, you know, however it evolves, kind of evolve in a direction where it's, you know, maybe a bit more defined and also friendly towards all of the things that it can kind of plug into in one way or another.
Yeah, that's great. I do feel like that the more clarity we have around the definition and the more clarity we have around the benefits and the trade-offs of that definition, make it easier to communicate with folks that are sort of outside the Jamstack umbrella, when you would choose Jamstack and when you would not choose Jamstack. And I feel like we really haven't sort of dove into when you would not choose Jamstack as deep as we need to, in a way that is, I don't know, as technologically upfront as maybe we could, or architecturally just the best way to communicate things. Go ahead,
I
Brittany.
think that we need to read it too as like we're not shaming people that don't use Jamstack. Like it's being
Oh, yeah.
inclusive in like a kind way, and we're not shaming you because you're not using Jamstack. So, and I don't think that Jamstack can ever really die, because it's like whatever it means to you, like if it's a static site or if it's like just about performance, whatever it is, like that exists in the world. It's not going to die. So I don't think it is, and I just think we all need to be just kinder and nicer in general. So I mean, I think if we start doing that as a community and present that out into the world, then people will see that and will come to that.
Yeah, that's just an incredible closing note. I don't think I could have put it any better myself. And so with that, I guess I will thank everyone for participating today. If you have further questions, I think that we will probably keep this conversation going, maybe have a couple more of these events in the future. I would love to keep this conversation going, because I do really feel like there's an incredible value in the Jamstack community, even if we might have disagreements about the exact details of technical architecture behind it. Yeah, there's a great power in organizing a community around around the Jamstack. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for people that watched online. And yeah,